Hey there, it's 6.3 Step 2, Paper 1 Strategies. Learning target students will be able to practice strategies for the Paper 1 exam. So what are some good strategies to kick this test's butt, which is what we are going to do. We are going to kick this test's butt. Well, let's take some notes in your packet on this stuff. First, you see the visual in there that looks similar to this. Excuse me, I updated it a little bit. I put a start and an end on there, so you might add that to your visual. I changed this to authorial choices so that it fits with the rubric instead of, what did I put in here, document? Writer's choices, I think, which, you know, same diff, but I'm just trying to be consistent with, oh, it said textual features. That is another term that used to be used in IB criteria. So I just sort of updated it. Sorry, it's not updated in your packet. And then we've got, this is really where we start, right? We start with, well, let me just go back one sec. We start here, we move to the effects, and then we end with some kind of meaning. But you have to start with these things, the words that are in the text, the images that are created, the tone that is the speaker's attitude that is created, how they're structured, the atmosphere that is created through the description. Those are our facts in a guided literary analysis. And so if we can get back to these and make literal claims about them, then we can come up with interesting effects and meaning in the end. All right, so start by looking for interesting words, images, moments where the tone or the speaker's voice is clear, interesting patterns of structure or form and details that create a larger feeling or atmosphere. And then you move, you analyze them by picking them out and using literary words to explain how they are interesting. Name it and claim it is a phrase I sometimes use. So call it what it is. This is audio imagery or sensory detail that evokes the sense of sound. That's maybe not what's interesting about it. That's its name, right? You're naming it. And then you move on to say the sound creates a haunting feeling that's interesting as it echoes in this stanza and that stanza, whatever it might be. The next thing to do is to look at how the authorial choices affect you as a reader. What do they make you think of? What do they make you feel? And the best way to do this is when you find patterns of authorial choices that create larger effects on what you're thinking and what you're feeling. And then finally, you interpret the meaning of the text. How do the choices and their effects work together to shape meaning? What are the larger implications? So what? Why is this text worth reading? What does it have to say about anything interesting or the human condition and life as we live it? Good things always to look for when you're looking for meaning are when you see contrasts or repetitions. So anything that repeats, anything that contrasts is going to lead you to something interesting. And oftentimes I find that IB chooses texts that highlight something about one of these themes: language, writing, reading, communication, or the production of art. And so those are all helpful things to look for in your text. All right, moving on to SCASI. SCASI is a strategy that works really well when you're first encountering a text. And I first, I think, described it to you when we were doing our poetry unit. So I wanted to remind you what it is. The first S stands for setting. So is there a place? Sometimes in poems there is no place. Sometimes there is. In the prose text, there probably will be a place, or if there's a play, if they use drama, we might see something of the place. So what is it? How is it described? And how as a reader does it make you feel? The C is for characters. Who's involved? Who is the speaker? And by the way, the difference between speaker and narrator When you are writing about poetry, you use the word speaker. Okay? And when you're writing about prose, so language that is not poetry, a short story, a memoir, something that is not poetry, you're going to use the word narrator. All right? And what do we know about them? What are the speaker's attitudes? What other people are involved? And what do we know about them? So that's a good thing to pick out with characters. Action is what the A stands for, what action takes place, or what is the situation, what, if anything, is going on. You might add to this, what is the tension, what seem to be the opposing forces that are working against each other, because there's usually some kind of tension that's set up in these short extracts. Style is the second S, and this is where we go beyond the literal meaning and we get to looking at the choices of language, the interesting things about the words and the way they're arranged. And there's another strategy, DITS, that will help you with this particular aspect of SCASI that I'll go over in a sec. Ideas, what's the idea? Either stated or underlying, or topic. What themes surface in the text and what are the larger implications? So again, looking for something that is repeated, something that is contrasting, can be a really helpful way to get at ideas. And then to also look for anything that has to do with language or the creation of art or communication. That will be helpful too to get to ideas. All right, so let's move on to DITS. DITS is another strategy that will remind you of the different things that you should be looking for when you look at style. The D in DITS stands for diction, and this is particular word choices and what they denote and connote. So denotation, that's that's the meaning of the word, the literal meaning of the word. It's to denote is to define exactly, refer to something outright explicit. Connote is to imply a meaning or condition, giving a hint, implicit. So oftentimes we have to read between the lines when we're doing guided literary analysis. And part of that is just looking at what each particular word connotes or what the connotation of each word is. And so that is something that is hinted at that we just sort of feel based on how this word is typically used. If we move on to imagery, imagery is details that evoke one or more of the five senses. So even though it seems sort of opposite to say that we have hearing imagery, right? It still is a thing. The fancy word for it is auditory imagery. But if you talk about a sensory detail that creates a sense of sound, that is just as good. Here's an example of sensory details from our last assessment. Thrown in light over night and day. So it's imagery because we can see this, it's Zeus who's being described, as he is thrown in light. There's light all around him, putting him at it in sort of a higher position, right? Over night and day. It's always bright, whether it's in the daytime or the evening. So that imagery evokes the sense of sight, maybe touch too, with light being warm and radiant. You can almost feel it, right? But that's a good example of imagery that would be also called sensory details. The other kind of imagery that we've been talking about is comparative imagery. And this is any time you have a clear detail that is used to compare one thing to another. So there's a figurative element rather than a literal element. And an example from our last assessment was net of pain. There was not a literal net that's trapping people because of their fate and what the gods have in store for them, but rather it's a figurative net made up of various circumstances and their consequences. So that imagery is comparative. So look for both of those when you're looking at imagery. Tone is the attitude of the speaker when we're talking about poetry, or the attitude of the narrator when we're talking about prose. And when we're talking about drama, you're really going to talk about the tone of a character, right? Because with drama, the most of what we read are what the characters say on stage. A tone might be objective and matter of fact. It might be contemplative. It might be sarcastic, questioning, angry, sincere. There are thousands of words, thousands of adjectives that could be used to describe a tone. And figuring out the particular tone is really an important part of your job as an analyst of a guided literary analysis. Structure, form is the S. How the text is organized, including stanzas, paragraphs, and lines and sentences. Look for how the text is broken up and what seems to be emphasized the most. That is a good way to think about structure. Look for the transitions between one section to another. It's another good way to look at structure. And look for how short, look for how the sentences are structured. Like, do they change a lot in one spot? Or do we have some parallel structures where we have the same kind of sentence structure repeated? Those are all good things to look at when we're talking about structure and form. And of course, we spent like 3 different lessons on this in the poetry unit. So you can always go back to that and remind yourself what you learned about structure and form in that unit. Atmosphere is the extra A in DITS. And this is the feeling of an environment as constructed by a writer's description of the environment and objects within that setting. So this is closely related to mood, but it's a little bit different. Sometimes they're used synonymously, atmosphere and mood. And I just wanted to point this out. Mood is the internal feeling the reader gets when reading the text, influenced by tone and atmosphere and everything else. So mood is sort of the larger feeling that the reader has that's created by everything else. All right, let's move on to color marking. What is color marking? Well, you have 3 key directions when you're color marking. The first is to look for some interesting patterns of language. Trace something specific that jumps out at you as being unique or unusual. The next thing is to label the pattern and try to be as specific as you can and use literary words too, if that works. And then finally make a literal statement about each pattern. That's one that no one could disagree with. And then an interpretive, debatable statement, one in which you investigate a meaning beyond the literal. All right, some examples of things to color mark might be parts of speech. This is a favorite one of mine. I love to trace all of the verbs. That's something I always do when I start reading a new text. How about words of shape or color or texture, time or space words? All of these are good things to trace and things that we've been talking about throughout. Here's an example I wanted to show you from JS's paper about Easter Monday in Memoriam ET, and show you kind of work through how she started and how she ended up with the essay that you read. So here's the poem on the left, and this first color mark in blue is imagery of letters. Her literal claim, well, the 3 examples are in blue here. First of all, the last letter, may I have a letter soon, 3 letters that you will not get. The letters in the first line the letter in the first line is referenced in the last line of the first stanza. And the letters that she wrote that he will not get are mentioned in the last line of the poem. So there's my literal claim. It's interesting because there is a pattern, right? They're referenced, in fact, directly quoted from at the end of the first stanza, and that letter that's referenced was mentioned in the first line. And then finally, the letters that won't ever be received because E.T. has died are mentioned in the last line. Debatable interpretive claim. The letters convey a feeling of regret because E.T. did not receive the letters that Farjeon wrote before he died. And she goes on to explain how the repetition here creates also a feeling of regret because it's quoting his letter. And of course, when he wrote the letter, he was alive. And so it is sort of echoing this lost soldier's voice as she repeats it here in the end of the stanza. And she takes a whole paragraph to explain exactly how this works. But these are the main literal claims and the main interpretive claims. You'll also notice that this ends up becoming basically her first key point, and we'll get to that in a little bit. All right, another pattern she noticed was the imagery of apples and garden life. And here are all of the different things listed. She may have said produce. That might be a word that could be used here too. Maybe one she didn't think of in that short amount of time. Here's her literal claim. The apples are described in the first stanza as E.T.'s favorite fruit, and in the second stanza, the orchard has ripe apple buds. Debatable interpretive claim. The imagery of apples in garden life create feelings of life and happiness turned into loss, feeling purposeless by the end of the poem as they contrast E.T.'s loss of life. And so the progression of the imagery is interesting because at first we have a box of apples, but by the end we have apple buds, and buds are what will become the apples. And so we have a movement from whole apples to really the beginning of the next round of apples. Now you might say that hints at new life, but at the same time, it's used in contrast directly with this idea that E.T. will not get letters because he's dead, is what is not explicitly stated but implied. And the juxtaposition, the fact that those two things are placed right next to each other is what J.S. argues actually creates this feeling of purposelessness for the speaker, because the growing apples are never going to be eaten now by E.T. It's his favorite fruit, but it doesn't matter because he is no longer alive. And so that was a really effective claim that she made, and pretty carefully thought up. Can't think of a better verb. All right, here's the third pattern. References to time and the passing of time. So we've got all of these references. Her literal claim, the phrase, "It was such a lovely morning," Easter Monday, and the eve are repeated from E.T.'s letter in the last stanza. So she really focuses on repetition, and that's so important in guided literary analysis, looking at words that are repeated. Here's the debatable interpretive claim. The repeating of E.T.'s words from his letter in the last stanza create the feeling that Farjeon is longing for the day when E.T. was still alive. So it's almost creating this echo, right, from the actual letter that E.T. wrote, as she is now on her own thinking of a new Easter Monday this time without him. Okay. Next question, remind yourself, how do I outline the essay? Well, the key with an essay is that, or the key with an outline is just that you're making a plan before you start writing, because it's a first draft essay and you're handwriting it. So you need to have a plan going into it, or you could easily get lost in terms of your organization. You're not going to have time to rewrite your essay. You're only going to write it once. You can have more than 3 key points in your essay, but generally it's a good number to try to include if you have 3 key points. You also need an introduction and a conclusion to make the IB examiners happy and give you a high score on criterion C. All right, so the basic outline is going to work like this. Your first paragraph is going to have some kind of opening that will be directly about the text. And it will end with a central assertion that will preview your 3 key points. The second paragraph will include a topic sentence about your first key point, and that might be your debatable claim, your interpretive claim from color marking. It doesn't have to be, but that is certainly one way to do it, and that is what JS did in her essay. The third paragraph is going to be about your second key point. Maybe that is maybe that's your debatable claim about the second pattern you found. And your fourth paragraph is going to be about your third key point, and maybe that is about your debatable claim from your third pattern. These paragraphs will then detail how you came to these debatable claims by using literal claims and text, and methodically taking the examiner through step by step how you got to the interpretation that you got to. And then finally, your central assertion is restated. Well, what should the central assertion include? The central assertion needs to include some kind of interpretive response to the guiding question. So you're going to make some kind of claim. You're going to take a stab at meaning after you've spent at least 20 minutes with the poem or extract and really trying to understand it. And it will preview or list your 3 key points. All right, let's take a look at JS's outline. Here is her central assertion, which we've already looked at before. She talks about regret due to unfinished business as a larger interpretive meaning. She talks about how she feels useless now as a larger interpretive meaning. And then she finally talks about her feelings of longing as a larger interpretive meaning. The 3 key points all have to do with imagery, which is the guiding question, and it's an authorial choice. So we always get back to that foundation, that first starting place of authorial choices and dits, right? All right, her first key point for her second paragraph, a feeling of regret is created by the letters. Her second key point, imagery of food and gardens is used to create feelings of life and happiness turned to loss and feeling purposeless. Her third key point, the references to time and the passing of it describe Farjean's feelings of longing. And then her central assertion is restated a bit differently for that conclusion. So this is the basic skeletal outline for JS's paper. And she then, after she had this, she then went on to write the essay and included all of the hows and the connecting parts and the literal claims and the text to support it to make it a valid argument. All right, last question. How do I write the essay? Well, you're going to be writing only one draft, and so that is really important to remind yourself. You are not going to have time to rewrite your essay. You're only writing one draft, and that's why it's so important to plan it out and then to follow that plan as you write. Stay focused on the guiding question throughout. Using language from the guiding question over and over is a very effective way to stay focused. Don't worry about repeating yourself, and that's fine if you're using language from the prompt over and over. That's a good thing. Show how you got to the meaning that you found, slowly and methodically in each body paragraph. Make lots of literal claims to explain how you got to that interpretive debatable claim, and support those claims with textual references. When you make an error or want to change something, draw a line through it. Just one line is good, and then you can write the correct word or phrase right above. You aren't going to be able to use whiteout, so don't bring that. Don't plan on using whiteout. And it's okay to make a mistake. Just correct it, and the examiner will not even think twice. All right, so these are some strategies to help you get started. The next step in the packet is for you to actually tackle one of, or a couple of texts that are from IB. One is a play, and then one is a nonfiction prose. And so tackle them. Try SCSI, try DITS, try outlining, do whatever you will, whatever you think you need to do at this point to help you prepare for the actual exam. All right, enjoy those texts and good luck. You're a genius.